All right, guys, let's pull back the curtain a little bit on the new Massachusetts broker fee law. A lot of people have been asking me about this, and it's set to take place August 1st of 2025. You could say that this is where communism meets capitalism, where the government says who's going to pay, but the market finds a way to make everybody pay more. That's the way that it goes. Now, look, on a surface level, this, I guess you could say, looks like a win for renters since they no longer have to pay a broker fee. But when you follow the money, I think the real impact ends up hurting the very people that it promises to help. The core issue here, it's pretty simple, okay? They're shifting broker fees to landlords, okay? They're taking it off of the tenant, which they normally paid, and shifting it to the landlords, but it doesn't eliminate the expense. It just effectively changes the name on the check. And historically, here's what happens. Landlords inevitably pass those costs on to the tenants in the form of higher rent. And I can tell you from personal experience, because I also am a realtor here in Massachusetts, landlords are already adjusting prices before the law kicks in. So we are already seeing rental rate spikes even before this takes place. And they are doing this to offset the anticipated cost that they will have to pay in terms of commission. Also, very quickly, I want to give a shout out to today's sponsor, which is Aura. This is a service I personally have used. I've been using them for months, and it's helped me avoid a major fraud issue. I'll talk about that experience a little bit later in the video. Now, the best way to understand how changes like this impact our market, easiest thing to do is to look at other markets that have implemented similar policies. And you don't need to go much further than New York. So the change here in Massachusetts really mirrors or mimics what New York did under what they called the Fair Act, and that happened last December. So in New York, the same idea was to ban tenant-paid broker fees. Guess what happened? It backfired. That's what happened. The risk here within the first few days of implementation was that the average rents went from $4,750 to $5,500, which is about a 15% increase. And meanwhile, what also happened is that listings disappeared from the market. Roughly 2,000 apartments completely vanished from StreetEasy. So the overall supply ended up dropping by 30%. The problem with a drop in supply is that it creates more demand. There's less opportunities to rent, and guess what? There's still the same amount of renters. So that creates a little bit of chaos within the market. And brokers, they warned people about this. They said to the tenants that if you're not paying the fee up front, I could guarantee you that the landlord's going to roll it into the rent. And that's exactly what happened in New York. That's what New York saw. But speaking of risks, quietly building in the background, this is exactly why I've been using Aura for the last few months, which is today's sponsor. So a few months ago, I got a critical alert from Aura, and they said they found that my password was leaked in a data breach, but also so was my social security number. It was found floating on the dark web. If you don't believe me, I'm going to share a screenshot on my screen here. Someone, somewhere, had access to my details, and they could have wrecked my credit, stolen my identity, or worse, I wouldn't even have known that this was happening. So Aura is an all-in-one digital safety tool that monitors your personal information across the web, and it'll alert you in real time. They track financial accounts, passwords, social security numbers, and even home titles. So they'll end up notifying you if somebody tries to take a loan out in your name. Now, they are offering my audience a free 14-day trial and up to 63% off of your subscription. So you could head over to aura.com/Mike Urban or click the link in the description. Now, back to the video. To understand what is happening and why these things are predictable, we need to consider just basic economics here, guys, and past rent control experiments, because this isn't something that's new. Anytime you place a ceiling on who could pay what and restrict market flexibility, you end up changing incentives. Landlords respond by shifting costs somewhere else. But the problem is actually much deeper than that. It's not only about rolling the costs into the tenant's rent. Look at it this way. If a tenant signs a lease for more than 1 year, the financial impact only compounds, especially if the landlord increased the rents. So look at it this way. This happens because the broker fee is now baked into the monthly rent. So the longer the tenant stays, the more they end up paying for what was once a one-time fee. So like in many cases, if a tenant signs a 2-year lease, the renter will absorb thousands of dollars in extra rent over the course of that longer term lease. The only time it could be a, let's say, a potential benefit is if they only lease the property for a year. But even then, here is the other problem. And that's once you have these inflated prices, they end up rippling throughout the market. So look at it this way. Once a unit in a neighborhood gets priced higher to compensate for the broker costs, once they close on that property, nearby landlords end up following suit because that closing ends up being a comparable unit. Okay, that sets the benchmark for setting the rent of future units. So what happens is this creates a trickle-down effect where every single new listing gradually inherits inflated prices, which then locks in higher rent for everyone in the long term, because now all of a sudden rental prices are skyrocketing everywhere because the previous closing is now comparable for the future listing. And we've seen this before. When rent control hit Massachusetts in the past, maintenance and safety violations surged. Fire rates increased because landlords couldn't afford upkeep. Why, you ask? Because guess what? They squeezed the margins and forced the owners to defer the repairs. Then there's the legal issues here. So here's what happens. Over 65% of smaller landlords, I'm sure they're fearing that they'll face lawsuits or paperwork headaches if they have to handle the rentals themselves without brokers. So that's the only possible way that they could offset not increasing the rent, is if they don't hire an agent to begin with. So real estate lawyers, if they hire, even if the tenant or the landlord hires a real estate lawyer, what could also happen is they will just refloat that cost into the rent as well. So there's economic impact everywhere here, right? And that is what the problem is. So in New York City, again, perfect example, brokerages warned of losing half of their workforce, right? Because what happened is rental agents, they left. And guess what? The listings went with them, right? There was less listings coming on the market. In Massachusetts, 73% of landlords say they rely on brokers for their business. If they lose those brokers and the market slows, guess what? That is a huge problem. So here's the bottom line. Shifting broker fees onto landlords is a costly illusion. It'll drive up rent, it'll reduce supply, and it could potentially divert maintenance dollars, at least for the people that are not trying to make up for that loss within the rent. But what it will do is give Maura Healey good headlines, and that's effectively what it's been doing. So Massachusetts is essentially just repeating New York's mistake, and I don't think we should relive the consequences that happened there. So if you care about issues like this, I would reach out to your state reps and complain, because again, when you're coming up with these policies, I always think that they should have somewhat of a model from other states before they make a huge, impactful decision like this. And when you look at other states and they're doing the same exact thing and it's not working, don't you think to yourself, geez, maybe we should reconsider this. Maybe we should do a more thorough investigation or some predictive analytics to try to figure out if this is going to be a net positive or a net negative. I don't know, guys. That's it for today's video. Appreciate you all. I'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye.